obliterated its own history by changing its name and surgically altering its face, is the hero or heroine of the story. And since I'm the one who's telling it and you don't know who I am, let me say that we'll get to the who of it, but not right now. Because now there's time enough not to hurry, to light the lamp and open the window to the moon and take a moment to dream of a great and broken city. Because when the day starts its business, I'll have to stop. These are nighttime tales that vanish in sunlight like vampire dust. Wait now. Light me up so we do this right. Yes. Hold me steady to the lamp. Hold it. Hold. Good. A slow pull to start with, to draw smoke low into the lungs. Yes. Oh my. Another for the nostrils, and a little something sweet for the mouth. And now we can begin at the beginning with the first time at Rashid's, when I stitched the blue smoke from pipe to blood to eye and out into the blue world. That, my friend, was an extract of Narcopolis, the first novel Jeet Thayil ever wrote, and the novel that really put him out there, and the novel that really shot him into sort of success and fame. And this was a novel that was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, did not win it. But this is not the novel I'm going to be reviewing today. The novel I'm reviewing today is called Low. I have been waiting for this novel to come out for ages, and I finally read it, and I'm really excited to talk about it. But before I begin, just to give you a bit of context, so that introduction that I just read is from Narcopolis, and that introduction is just one sentence that goes on for a few pages. Of course, I did not read all of it for you, but it just shows you how beautiful a prose Jeet Thayil has, and that is down to the fact that he has always been a poet. So before he became a full-time novelist, he was a poet, and I had the pleasure of reading some of his poetry, which I found amazingly beautiful. And I was lucky enough to go to one of the readings he did in Delhi, and I was like super thrilled when he was reading one of his poems. I remember it was a poem about Baudelaire. It was brilliant. And then I asked him a question about like what are the French authors that inspired him. It was a stupid question because I was like, I don't know, 19 or 20, really nervous to like see my literary hero in front of me. But I'm really happy that today I'm going to be talking about his book. And just to give you some context about Jeet Thayil, the novelist, because we're not going to be discussing his poetry today. So he has written 3 novels basically. Narcopolis is the novel that I just read you an extract from, the beginning lines. So this was nominated for the Man Booker Prize, like I told you. And his second novel is the Book of Chocolate Saints. It's a bigger book, as you can say. This was, I think, long listed for the Man Booker Prize. I'm really sorry about my throat today, guys. Like, I have the flu, I think. Hopefully it's not coronavirus. But I'm sorry for my voice. It's gonna be a bit, like this. So this was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize, did not win it. And finally, Low. But Jeet Thayil, the man who wrote Low, does not sort of need the Man Booker Prize anymore, because he last year was part of the judge and jury of the Man Booker Prize. So when Margaret Atwood and this other author who won the Man Booker Prize last year, because it was Cher, I think, like this year or last year, I forgot. So that prize was actually attributed by a jury, and Jeet Thayil was in the jury. So in a way, he's bigger than the Man Booker Prize now, and I'm like, I mean, it reflects badly on the Man Booker Prize that they haven't given Jeet Thayil the prize. It's their loss. So let's begin our review of Low. So let us begin this review by first discussing the plot of this novel. So basically, this novel does not have a plot. It is the whole story of the novel happens over the span of one weekend. So long story short, the protagonist of this novel, his wife dies. She kills himself. And the protagonist, who lives in Delhi after the death of after the funeral of his wife, flies to Bombay and spends a weekend in Bombay doing a lot of drugs. And that's it. That's the plot of the novel. So it's basically Jeet Thayil carrying the novel by sheer quality and style of the prose, and there's not really much to it plot-wise. So that is the first thing you need to know. Also, the protagonist of the novel is called Dominique Ulysse, which is very close to Ulysses. Like it sounds closer to Ulysses. And in the very first page of the novel, there's when the protagonist is flying from Delhi to Bombay, someone actually calls his name wrong. Name wrong. They call him Ulysses, which is a clear reference to James Joyce's novel. And that novel also happens, like it's a massive novel, but the duration of the plot is just one day. So I think that is a reference to the fact that this whole novel like happens over the span of just 2 days. So it's really taking time and sort of stretching it out and sort of seeing how time can be a very subjective thing when someone is going through grief. And in this case, it's the protagonist who's really going through grief because his wife has just died. And that is where I would say that this novel is very different from the first two novels, like of Jeet Thayil, because Narcopolis and the Book of Chocolate Saints are essentially about nostalgia. These two novels are about Jeet Thayil remembering a Bombay that is lost forever, a Bombay full of poets that no one remembers anymore. Their works are forgotten, that city is forgotten, those dark underbellies of Bombay are forgotten forever. So while these two books are about nostalgia, this book is completely against nostalgia. This is actually about grief, in which all sort of remembrance is seen as a bad thing, as a hurtful thing. And that makes sense because Jeet Thayil himself said that the manuscript for the first two books was essentially a same big monster manuscript, and these two books sort of came about from it, whereas this book comes like separately. And I mean, I'm not going to comment on Jeet Thayil's personal life, but I know that he himself went through a personal tragedy, and that might or might not have inspired this novel. But I mean, we're not going to comment on that, especially given the fact that the author is still alive. I don't think that's a nice thing to do. But just to give you an idea that how different these novels are stylistically and thematically, the first two from the one we're going to reviewing, let's look at the first line, the first phrase of the Book of Chocolate Saints, and it goes like, "Praise the broken world, for it will vanish in a day, and in a day be replaced by nothing." So, beautiful as usual, and it starts off in style, and it also starts with praising a vanished world, praising remembrance, which is basically what Jeet Thayil does very stylishly in these two novels. Whereas if you read the first sentence of Low, you'll notice a difference right away. So in the very first chapter, line 1, we simply have, "From the window of the aircraft, Dominique Ulysse saw a gleaming slum of tin and tarpaulin, close enough to touch. Patchwork shacks crawled downhill, the blue roofs weighted with rocks. The shanty town came right up to the edge of the runway, and the plane seemed to skim the houses as it landed." The first thing I noticed that Jeet Thayil is not trying to be amazingly articulate or prosaic or poetic in these first lines. It's just a mundane description of something someone sees from the aeroplane, and what they're seeing is when they're landing in Bombay is the ugliness of the shanty town. So there's nothing poetic about it, and that there immediately I knew that this novel is going to be different thematically, because Jeet Thayil has a habit of starting with a sort of a poetic bang, and that thing was completely absent. So this sort of austerity in style might be suggestive of something that we discover as we go on reading the novel, because this comparison that I made about nostalgia and grief is sort of very present in here. Nostalgia is just symbolic of pain, and it does not represent any sort of beauty or like grandiose remembrance that was just the main theme of Jeet Thayil's previous works. So what marks this shift is basically the idea of grief, because he pits grief against nostalgia, and this novel is all about grief. And in a way, this sort of explores the theme of grief in sort of depths that actually make you uncomfortable. For example, Jeet Thayil sort of challenges the normal notions of grief. So I'm pretty sure you might be familiar with the Kubler-Ross model of grief, like the 5 stages of grief that a person goes through before sort of he arrives at acceptance. So in one of the passages, Jeet Thayil takes on this model, and this is what he says about it. "The Kubler-Ross model was exactly that, a model. It didn't apply to real life. It was designed for the classroom and the seminar, an entire laughable thesis built around the idea that the dying had the presence of mind to proceed chronologically from denial to acceptance. The model had nothing to do with the living, who would spend the rest of their lives trying to process a single commonplace event. for whom notions of stages did not exist, for whom there was no timeline, no demarcation, no five easy movements ending in some kind of Zen acceptance and forgiveness. No stages, but an infinite spectrum, 1,000 adjustments without an end in sight. Nothing here was linear or chronological. There was no beginning and no end. You moved back and forth like a time tourist, at sea without a compass, nothing above you but the tearful glimmer of the stars. Grief, like time, is circular. So this is a very fascinating take on grief. It basically says that all these sort of classification and compartmentalization of feelings that people tend to do don't really apply to a personal human experience, and he sort of explores the infiniteness of the idea of grief and also the impossibility of actually expressing it. Let us now speak about the title of the book itself, Low. What does that mean, and why is the book called Low? And this is like a theme that keeps returning, and the author addresses it many a times because it has a multitude of meanings. So first, let's talk about Low from the point of view of Aki, which is the protagonist's wife, who dies and then who commits suicide, and then the protagonist moves to Bombay for a weekend and does all these drugs and has these hallucination trips. So there is a paragraph in which the author talks about what Low signifies for Aki, the wife, and he says, he remembered the multitudes of meaning the word low held for Aki. Or if he asked what she'd been doing all day, she would say, I was low, as if it were a full-time job. If he asked her where she'd been, she'd say, I've been low, as if it were a republic to which she had a multiple entry 20-year visa. Or she would say, listen, sunshine, I better warn you, the low is coming. I can feel it. Once he had suggested they take a weekend trip out of Delhi, and she had said, I can't do it tomorrow, I'm going to the low. As if her low country lay everywhere like a vast spiritual archipelago. The low was the most dangerous when it coincided with her periods, the physically torturous episodes that stretched sometimes for a week. She experienced cramps and crippling pain when she could do little more than lie in bed and a hot water bottle pressed to her tummy. She had killed herself on the day her period began. It was as random and contingent as that. So as you can see, that this word has many significations in terms of this character sort of suffering from a case of low, but also from the fact that low is a feeling that converts itself into a mental space where the characters almost reside. Now this is just solely about the wife of the protagonist. The protagonist Ulysses himself experiences low in many ways. There is this scene in which he just walks up to these street side junkies who are doing heroin of aluminium foil sitting in a dingy, dirty corner, and he just starts doing drugs with them, and he says that I've arrived at the low and I'm hanging out with the people in the low. So there is an actual space in real sort of space and time that is shown as the low, but at the same time there is a low that is inside his own mental space. And of course the juxtaposition of the fact that the author is low, but he gets to the low by getting really high, because all he's doing throughout these 200 odd pages is shooting heroin, snorting cocaine, and doing all sorts of drugs. He even does a drug called meow meow. I don't know what that is, but he keeps doing it. And so all that is happening, and the author gets really low by getting really high. And you see what I mean? It's there in the cover. I don't know. They've expressed it somehow. I don't know how to say it. But yeah, so that is a really cool theme to explore in a sort of really cool way. And I really enjoyed the sort of multiple interpretations of low and how it's linked to the idea of grief. Now let's quickly talk about the writing style of Jeet Thayil in this novel. So as you know, Jeet Thayil has been a poet and his prose is beautiful. I wouldn't say it's as beautiful as it has been in the previous couple of books, but that is sort of intentional because the sentences here are shorter. The words that are used are not sort of very poetic and metaphorical. Sometimes they're brute, sometimes they're small, sometimes the sentences themselves express the impossibility of describing something that is so personal, that is so sad. So I feel like the theme that the author is going for is to be at a loss of words, to not sort of really say things. And we see that the protagonist there does not speak a lot. He's sort of surrounded by this buzz of the world where he's listening to other people talk. He's constantly listening to sort of people talking on the television, the people around him discussing things. So this is a book about the impossibility of writing and translating sort of grief into words, and that is something that I really enjoyed. And also, where Jeet Thayil classically excels is the description of drug trips. So when he is really high, the protagonist is extremely high on a heroin trip, or like doing cocaine or meow meow, and he's talking to his dead wife. Those passages are really beautifully described. That sort of, is it really afterlife, or is he really high, or is he hallucinating, to create that sort of ambiguous text that is a bit like in smokes and shredded in sort of mystery and intoxicating. Basically, that sort of text is really beautifully created by Jeet Thayil, and he's a master at that. Like, there were times when I was reading this and I felt like I need to breathe, because it's like, it made me feel like I'm taking those drugs and I'm really high. So he really is good at creating those after drug, or the effect of a high through text. So that is really, really beautifully done by Jeet Thayil. So one last theme that I want to discuss before we move on to the final verdict is the political commentary. So I know that this is a novel in which the protagonist is going through something really personal, and he's dealing with his own grief, and he's sort of drowned in this guilt and grief about the death of his wife, and there seems to be no space for anything else. And yet there is sort of a parallel political commentary that doesn't happen through the protagonist much, but by the people that surround him. So there are a lot of characters that keep coming in and going out and who talk politics, and the protagonist himself keeps consuming videos of Donald Trump. And in a very morbid way, he sort of sees Donald Trump as a merchant of doom. He actually has admiration for Donald Trump, but that is sort of a very weird, morbid, cynical admiration, because he's certain that Donald Trump is in a way leading to annihilation and destruction of the world, and which is something he deeply desires, in the sense his wife is dead, the world as he knows it has come to an end. So Donald Trump sort of promises in a very weird way that destruction that he sort of craves in a very self-destructive way. So in that way, he manages to criticize Donald Trump and his bigotry in a very cynical, messed up way. And also there was a lot of commentary on the Modi government and how sort of the country is going towards extremism and like almost fascism. And the author, like the protagonist, never does it himself, but he's sort of surrounded by people who talk about these things. And in a way, the protagonist seems to relish the fact that the whole country and the world, because of Donald Trump, is going towards annihilation, towards this sort of very dark place. And perhaps that would be an end. And it's only when everything comes to an end can we hope to begin again. So in a very messed up way, the protagonist takes comfort in extreme right-wing politics. So it is a very contentious, sort of controversial way of thinking about it, which is sort of very beautifully done. He manages to get in political commentary in a book that is strictly about something so personal, and that is quite admirable, and I really enjoyed that. So final thoughts. There are three things that I really want to talk about. The first is stylization of taking drugs. So the problem with Jeet Thayil is that he writes so beautifully that even when his protagonist is sort of going into these drug trips, he's in a really dark place taking all sorts of drugs, it is written so beautifully that it might actually be sort of stylizing drugs, which I'm 100% sure was not the intention of the author, but he can't help the fact that he's such a great author that the best parts of the book are when someone gets really high and then gets really low, if you know what I mean. So that's something Jeet Thayil can't help, but then that is something I thought I should say, that in a way, I know that this novel is not promoting taking drugs, but ends up stylizing it. And also, a negative, the only negative I found in this novel, so there were actually two, sorry. The first is the fact that there are a lot of characters, but none of them are completely developed except for the protagonist and his wife, which is fair because the whole book is about the relationship between the protagonist and his wife and his dead wife. But there were also a few interesting characters that kept coming in and going out, and I would have liked to see more of that. But one of the things that I also did not like was the very last paragraph of the book. So there's a sort of false hope, redemption at the very end, and the author goes like, if this was possible, well, then anything was possible, even forgiveness, even joy. So the redemption in the end is almost like a fuck you to the reader, in a way. Like, you go on for grief for ages and ages and ages, and suddenly there's redemption. But I could see that this is a sort of an ironical redemption and ironical sort of false hope at the end. That, look, you wanted a happy ending, fuck you. Here's a happy ending for you. So it's sort of done in that way. That's my reading of it, because if the author is being serious about this happy end, it is not sort of plausible at all. So I quite believe the fact that the happy end, or like this sort of epiphany, or sort of redemption in the end, is almost ironical and cynical, and like a fuck you to the reader, as in, like, do you really expect this book to end up in a happy way? Of course it won't. So I sort of read it as a sort of a false hope, ironical redemption, if you fall for it, you're stupid kind of ending. And one last thing that I want to say before I end this video is, there is a really messed up scene in which the protagonist's dead wife's ashes are snorted by someone because they think it's drugs. That is one of the most messed up things I've ever read. I laughed a lot, but at the same time I was so uncomfortable that there's someone who snorts his dead wife's ashes, and then the protagonist ends up snorting his own wife's ashes too in the end. That was the most messed up thing I've read in a long time, but it makes you laugh, but in a really uncomfortable way. So all in all, I would say this is a brilliant book. I would really recommend you to read it, but read it if you're not feeling really low, because it's a heavy book. Yep, that's it from my side, and see you guys next time.